It's interesting how a lot of these songs, even the more upbeat ones, they just recognize the fact that life is difficult and a lot of us are carrying different burdens. And that's going to fit really well with what we're going to see Jesus experience. And hopefully this conversation that we have this morning will be encouraging to you if you feel like you're weighed down by a lot of things. Sometimes we forget that God, He may just know exactly how we feel. And so hopefully this morning will be encouraging to you in different ways that way as well. I want to start off by just recapping the last couple of weeks. We've been working through Matthew's gospel, his account of the life of Jesus Christ. And one thing that as we walk toward the events of the cross and Easter, which are about a chapter, less than a chapter away at this point in time, things are really accelerating in Matthew's story. What we're seeing is as things move toward the cross and Jesus' death and suffering, there's all these different Bible images that Matthew brings into the picture, and really that other gospel writers bring in as well. And this is intentional. The cross is this intersection, and it's intended to be of all these different Bible images from throughout, because you need all the different angles to understand different aspects of what Jesus is doing and why this is happening. All these things are coming together. And 2 weeks ago, we talked about the Passover feast and how Jesus was celebrating that with his disciples, his followers, his students, the night before his death. And that in itself is very significant. Just like the Passover lamb underwent death so that people could be rescued from Egypt, from slavery, but from death as it went through Egypt and the surrounding areas. Even so, Jesus' death was very similar, in that his death provides a way of rescue for people, a way of salvation for people. And then there's other images as well. And last week we talked about the idea of covenants and how when Jesus took, as part of the Passover meal, one of the cups of wine and also the bread that reminded people of the affliction that Israel went through centuries before in slavery in Egypt. Those things were symbolic as well, but they symbolized a covenant. And that was a partnership between, in this case, between people and God himself. We had this partnership to come together and join God in the work that he was doing in the world, but people over and over again backed out of that partnership, and that came with a penalty, and that induced fear. Because people were signing up for something with God and then backing out of it, and what Jesus came to do, he said, was establish a new covenant, and that was something where, one, it would change people's hearts so that we would have a tendency and would have a little more success in this partnership with God because we'd have a new heart. But also it took all the fear out of it because he took the penalty for breaking those partnerships with God on himself. And that's part of what his death accomplished. It was to bring us into this relationship with God that wasn't a fearful relationship anymore. And many of us, maybe we grew up in churches or religious, perspectives, or just personally we had this opinion about God that, my right relationship with God is one of fear, But in that sense of always being afraid of God, it's not quite what the Bible is aiming for, and Jesus' sacrifice makes it a whole different relationship. He takes the fear out of partnering with God, and that's such a refreshing thing. And this morning we're going to come into another image that presents another picture of Jesus and how he steps toward the cross and what he's facing and dealing with. But this image is a picture of how Jesus feels, not of the events that are happening, but of Jesus' heart, his soul, the things that he's actually feeling. So if you ever wanted a window into how God feels, this is a great opportunity to take a look at that. And I want to start by looking at something that none of us really enjoys, and that's pressure. And maybe some of you are feeling a lot of pressure from different things in life right now, some heavy weights that are hanging on you, kind of pulling you down. I think about there's some channels on YouTube where there's these hydraulic presses, and they're just taking, tons and tons of force and just hammering down on an object. And sometimes we feel like that personally. And there's an image, because of where Jesus is in this time of prayer, it's a very similar image that we're supposed to connect with. It's a picture of how Jesus is feeling at this moment as well. I want to start off, we're in Matthew chapter 26, starting verses 36 and going on for about 10 verses this morning as we take a look at this. I've got a lot of questions that I want to ask you, and so this is going to be more of a discussion than a lecture this morning, so I want your input. And hopefully we'll discover some things, not only about Jesus and how he feels, but how we feel and how we navigate these times of pressure and burdens and hardships in our life as well, and just realize that God knows how we feel because he's been there personally. But we start off with this verse. It says, Jesus came with them. This is after they dismissed from the Passover meal to a place called Gethsemane. And I want to show you some photos of Gethsemane, just to give you visual. So if we can look through some of these. This is a map, and Jerusalem is that picture that's on the left, kind of the city that's walled, and then there's a small little brook or river. That's the Kidron Valley to the east of Jerusalem. And then on the east side of that, so on the right side of the screen, you see little mountains. And those are the hills that are across from Jerusalem, less than a mile away. That's called the Mount of Olives in the surrounding area. And that's where Jesus is at this point in time. If you want a visual for what it looks like today, we'll go to the next scene here. This is the Mount of Olives. These olive trees were probably not there when Jesus was there. They are very old, probably about, at this point, 800 or 900 years old. But the Romans came in and they besieged Jerusalem in 70 AD, and they hacked down all the trees across on the Mount of Olives to build their siege works. And so these are a little bit later than those. But you can go today, and some of you may have been there, to the place where Jesus prayed, at least geographically, and they have a garden with olive trees that's there currently. So it's still there on the Mount of Olives across from Jerusalem. As far as archaeology, they found a Jewish ritual bath, which they would bathe ritually before they would process olive oil as part of the ritual there. And just the name of the place itself, the Mount of Olives in Gethsemane, which we'll look into in a second, it comes from a Hebrew phrase, Gath Shemanim, and it means oil press. Olive oil press, olive trees. And so everything tells us, this is a grove of olive trees, and this is where they would produce olive oil at that point in time in history. And so when you make olive oil, you take olives and you put them under a tremendous crushing weight. There's a couple of processes. This is the first process. First, you crush the olives, and this is a handheld olive crusher. The next picture is one that you would not do by hand. You'd probably have a donkey or some animal attached to the millstone and just, walk around. You put the olives down and you crush them. And then after you crush the olives, the second process at this point in time in history was, you can see kind of on the left side of those, a stack of round kind of objects. Those are baskets, and the baskets are woven in such a way that they would go flat when you would press on them. And so they would load those baskets up, sometimes in several levels, with the crushed olives. And then they had this kind of lever that they would put weights on one end of, and it would just smash down with a stone on top of those baskets and press harder and harder. And then they had kind of a basin with a channel that flowed out into a larger basin, or a place that they could catch it in a jar or something of that nature. And so all the oil that was pressed out would flow out that bottom part. And so these olives were just being crushed, and then they were just being smashed until the oil poured out. If you want to see what it would look like in reality, this is it's a reproduction, but this is something, similar to what you would experience if you were pressing olive oil at the time of Jesus, just to give you a visual. But the whole idea is that what's happening to the olives, literally, is what Jesus feels is happening to him. This is what he says as verse 36 continues. It says, Jesus told his students, his disciples, sit here while I go over there and pray. It says he took along Peter and the two sons of Zebedee, which are James and John, and he began to be sorrowful and troubled. And just to give you a little picture of the sorrow that he was experiencing, this same word, they translated the Hebrew Bible into Greek, and they would use Greek translations at this time pretty frequently. And the same word, it's a Greek word that Matthew's using in his gospel, but it's used in that translation of the Old Testament. And here are some places that it appears, just to give you an idea of the similar kinds of feelings that other people experience, to give you a visual into what Jesus is experiencing. When he says Jesus began to be sorrowful, it's in the same way that Cain felt. If you remember that story of Cain and Abel toward the beginning of the Old Testament, when God rejected his offering. So think about the feeling of rejection. That's the kind of sorrow that Jesus was feeling. It's the way David felt when he found out one of his sons had been killed in battle. You imagine losing one of your children. Some of you have. And that hit, that weight when you realize that a family member or a child or a close friend had died, that initial hit, that's what Jesus is feeling. It was the way that Mordecai felt in the book of Esther when he heard that the king of Persia had authorized the genocide of the Jewish people, which were his people. The king said, you can kill these people on a certain day. And that decree had been signed. The way that he felt in that moment, that's the kind of sorrow Jesus is experiencing. Or the way that Joseph's brothers felt. Remember, they had sold him into slavery years previously, and then they found themselves standing before him when he had risen to second in command over the nation of Egypt. And when they realized our brother that we threw into a pit and sold into slavery, he has our lives in his hand. He can imprison us for the rest of our lives, or he can order our execution. In that moment, the feeling they felt, that's what's going on. That's the kind of feeling that Jesus is carrying. So it's this really intense sorrow. It says, and he felt troubled. And that just means full of heaviness, that weight that you just can't shake that's pulling you down. And the New Testament uses that word in another place where Epaphroditus, one of Paul's missionary companions, one of the church leaders, his friends had heard that he had a terrible illness, and it could have been a terminal illness. They didn't know at the time whether he would die from it or not. And think about that. Maybe you felt that as well, but like the weight of knowing that your friends think that they're about to lose you, that kind of heaviness. That's what Jesus had hanging on him at that moment. So basically, Jesus' entire being, his body, his mind, his emotions, his spirit, it's so overwhelmed with grief and heaviness that he literally feels like he's dying, even though he hasn't died yet. He feels like that. And again, maybe some of you identify with that. Maybe you have things weighing on you right now that like sometimes you feel like you're dying because the burden and the weight of something on you is just so heavy. You feel like you're an olive in a basket just being crushed under the weight of a rock. And so this isn't insignificant or unintentional that Jesus is in this place where olives are crushed, because the exact same thing is happening to his entire being at this point in time. Why do you think Jesus felt that way? Why do you think he felt like he was being crushed? What kinds of things might have been weighing on him? What do you think?
All our sins.
Okay, the sins of humanity. That would be that's an impossible thing for me to even visualize how that might affect Jesus, right? I mean, how does the perfect God feel carrying all the crookedness of us? I don't know. But it would seem like that would be a huge weight. Anything else you think might be weighing on Jesus at this point in time? Yes? People's unbelief? Yeah. I mean, you've got so many people, and it's like, not only did he try so hard to explain who he was, but the entire Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament up until this point, like prophets have like gone out of their way to give people a way to recognize this promised Messiah, this God with us figure. And nobody gets it, you know. What else might have been weighing them down? Yes?
The physical punishment he was coming.
Yeah. It says in one of the other Gospels, Jesus knew, like he knew what he was going to face. You don't know what you're going to face in the next 24 hours. I don't know. But he knew all the details of what he was going to face. Can you imagine the weight of that, you know, knowing what happened? Anything else you think might have been weighing on him, weighing him down? I mean, maybe loneliness. Sorry, go ahead.
That his father would have to turn his back on him. It would break his relationship with the father.
Yeah, that's another thing that I think is impossible for us to quite fathom. We know what it's like to have somebody walk away from a relationship with us, but we don't know what it's like to have like the being that you have been, you know, one with for all of forever. You know, there's that perfect faithfulness. To suddenly feel that loneliness and that isolation and that disconnect. Yeah. And all these things, I mean, they're just pulling down on Jesus. I was trying to find a place where like a human besides Jesus, right, who's God in the flesh, according to the Bible at least, where another person has similar feelings, just to kind of give you a window in. And I think this psalm, it's Psalm 38, and I think it gives us a picture of not only what David was feeling at the moment, but maybe a little bit of a window into what Jesus may have been feeling. And, you know, David talks about how his sins are weighing on him, and perhaps at this point in time, the sins of humanity, which are going to be transferred onto him. Maybe that's part of what's weighing on him, maybe not. We don't know all those details. But I want to just read this psalm to kind of walk you in to some feelings that Jesus may have been experiencing, some feelings that David was experiencing, and maybe feelings that you are experiencing because you're in similar situations of crushing. And maybe this would be a good psalm for you to pray, or maybe elements of it would. But David writes this in Psalm 38, hundreds of years before the time of Jesus walking the earth. Oops. Put that back on. He says, "Lord, do not punish me in your anger or hit me in your rage." Now, David, he's a straight shooter, and he's not always telling us exactly how God feels about us, He's telling us how he feels that God feels about him or about us in the moment. So don't take everything here as saying, well, God is enraged with me. This is how David feels that God feels at the moment, but not actually how God may be. But he's just going to, again, throw his emotions at God full force. Do not punish me in your anger or hit me in your rage. Your arrows have sunk into me and your hand has pressed down on me. There is no soundness or health in my body. There is no peace in my bones because of my errors. My twisted ways have covered over my head. They're like a load that's too heavy for me to bear. I'm bent over and I'm brought very low. All day long I go around mourning, for my insides are full of burning pain and there's no health in my body. I feel faint and severely crushed. I groan because of the anguish of my heart. Lord, my every desire is in front of you. My sighing is not hidden from you. My heart races, my strength leaves me, even the light of my eyes has faded. So it really puts you in that moment. This is poetry, right? So it evokes our emotions. And it helps us not only empathize with David, but maybe say, oh, I felt that way, or I'm feeling that way right now. We walk into it, we identify with it, we empathize. He continues, my loved ones and friends stand back from my affliction, and my relatives stand at a distance. I think about the parallels in this next section of what Jesus experienced. All of his friends, they're like, oh, all right, once the things that are going to happen, in a few moments more past this point in time, once he's betrayed, those friends, those family members, they're at a distance at that point on. And maybe some of your friends and family members, they've stepped back a little bit. They're at a distance, from your affliction. David says, those who intend to kill me set traps, and those who want to harm me threaten to destroy me. They plot treachery all day. These things are happening to Jesus too. I'm like a deaf person. I don't hear. I'm like a speechless person who does not open his mouth. I think about these scriptures that talk about Jesus not, saying a word or opening his mouth at a trial. And I'm like, this is too weird that all these things seem to be happening, and Jesus is undergoing this as well. I'm like a human, David says, who doesn't hear and has no arguments in his mouth. For I put my hope in you, Lord. You will answer me, my Lord and my God. I said, don't let them rejoice over me, those who are arrogant toward me when I stumble. For I'm about to fall, and my pain is constantly with me. And then David says, so I confess my moral failures. I'm anxious because of my sin. But my enemies, they're vigorous and they're powerful, and many people hate me for no reason. So it's not just me and my flaws. Some people just hate me and there's no reason behind it. Those who repay evil for good attack me for pursuing what's good. Lord, don't abandon me. My God, don't be far from me. Hurry to help me, my Lord, my salvation. Again, maybe that's an excellent prayer for us to pray when we feel this crushing weight. And maybe there's some scary similarities between what Jesus is going through and what David is praying in a similar point in life as well. This is kind of vulnerable, so feel free not to say anything. But I know some of you have experienced things like this. Some of you are experiencing things right now. But if you've walked through a time of grief and heaviness like this, where the weight of something's just pressing into you, how do you cope with that? How have you coped with that? Anybody be so willing as to share? Yes?
Prayed a lot.
Okay, prayed a lot.
All the time.
Yes, in the back.
I dove into the book of Job.
Dove into the book of Job. Like Job, because he's going through this pit of, just awful, unimaginable tragedy and grief. And it seems like you want comfort from somebody who's been there, not, from somebody unfamiliar with that. So that's. Anybody else? Yes.
I pray specifically to say, God, how are you going to get me out of this?
Okay. So specific prayers. God, how are you going to get me out of this? Because I am powerless. I can't do anything. In the back there? Did somebody have their hand? Yeah.
Talk to people, friends who understand, who've been there.
Talk to friends who understand, friends who've been there. That's great. Yes.
I usually pray, God, please guard my soul.
Okay. God, please guard my soul.
Perseverance and trust
Okay, perseverance, trust in God's word. I'd say maybe trust in God himself as well. Yes. Listen to music, specifically like Christian music you said that's going to point your mind, toward God and a good perspective in that. These are ways that you cope. And we're going to see how some of Jesus' friends cope with this and how he copes with it in a moment as well. Let me ask one more question before we move on. What is this moment in Jesus' experience? What does it reveal about God? I mean, the fact that Jesus, he's being crushed. He is entering into a time of prayer. He's got 3 of his friends with him. Does this show us anything about God? Because we don't think of God as going through these kinds of things, right? Yes?
I just see it as he must be struggling with. There's a struggle.
There's a struggle, yeah. We don't think God and struggle, right, in the same sentence. But there's a struggle, yeah. Anything else that you see about God in this moment? Yes? He keeps his word. Give me a little more detail, like in how does that bring this out for you?
He doesn't want to turn his back on Jesus.
Okay.
Because he's proven that this is the only way for a real life with him.
So Sue's talking about how just there's this conflict because God is always one with Jesus. He's never turned his back on him, but he's got this conflict because of, sins, the flaws, the failures, however you term it, of the world, and how people have chosen to do their own thing and stepped away from God's projects in the world and all this. So there's this conflict. Yes?
I believe God hurts as much as he does.
God hurts as much as he does. Yeah, and there is hurt happening here. Yeah, we don't think of God maybe as feeling those kinds of emotions. Again, I think one of the things is God gets us. He knows how we feel when we're in the depths of depression or heartache or unimaginable loss because he's actually experienced that feeling. Or, some terminal condition where your life is about to end. He knows. He knows what it's like in those moments. Shows us, I think, how to cope with grief and loss. We'll see that in a moment. But also just the extent that God's willing to go through. And Sue is kind of touching on that as well. That the Father would go to the extent of forsaking the Son in that moment because of the sins of the world, but also that Jesus would endure all this knowing what was coming and not just walk away. I mean, this is like revelation about the way that God is and the way that God feels for us. Verse 38, it says, he said to them, and this was the 3 that were with him, Peter, James, and John, that he invited to come a little closer, I'm deeply grieved to the point of death. Then he said, remain here, so stay connected, stay close by, and stay awake with me. Stay awake with me. So he leaves the group, most of them, 8 of them. He asks his 3 closest friends to be with him, and he says, I want you to be with me, and I want you to stay awake. Why do you think he does that? Why do you think he leaves part of the group, he brings 3 people, and then he says to the 3 with him, stay awake. Don't fall asleep on me. What do you think? I mean, these are places where the Bible doesn't tell us, right? But it's that way on purpose. There's gaps in the story to cause us to think and ponder the possibilities and talk about this as a group. It's how we process the Bible. It's how people have tried to process the Bible for, millennia now at this point. So what do you think? Why do you think Jesus operates this way? Yeah?
He knows that everybody else is going to go to sleep on him.
Maybe. Dick said he knows everybody else is going to go to sleep on him. Okay? Maybe he does.
He trusts in those 3 just like we would trust in our closest friends to be there with him in his grief.
That's a good thought. How many of you invite all of your friends? You post on Facebook. Some of you do because, you're good with that. You're open and vulnerable. But others of you probably wouldn't ever share your deepest, heartaches with everybody. But maybe you would invite a few close friends into it. And that's kind of what Shar was saying, he brings his closest friends into this more intimate moment with him. Yeah. Any other thoughts about that? I don't know. I'm just posing the question. There's no necessarily specific answer or right answer to that. I think that's part of it. I mean, I would operate that way. I would bring my closest friends into something like that, but not necessarily everyone. But then I think there's also some reason why he told him to stay awake. And we'll get into that in the next couple of verses as well. I want to transition from looking at the pressing aspect of things and how Gethsemane kind of focused on that, and wrap up with a little bit of a look into prayer. Just a couple things. Here's a basic observation. I think this is not just unintentional, not coincidental. Jesus, at this moment, he's praying, but he's actually speaking with God in a garden of fruit trees, olive trees or fruit trees. And think about where you've seen people talking with God in a garden full of fruit trees before. I mean, page 1, right? Or page 2 or wherever, somewhere in there. And I wonder if this is supposed to get us to compare those moments and say, I wonder what state, the first humans were in when they were walking and talking with God unhindered at a garden full of fruit trees. They were innocent before God. They had this open relationship, and maybe we're supposed to get some of the similar thoughts. Jesus is this ideal human where all of us have walked away from our partnership with God in some way and been unfaithful to it. But Jesus, he's not been unfaithful. So it's really ironic what he's dealing with next and what he has to go through. Verse 39, it says, going a little farther, he fell face down and he prayed, my Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Let this cup pass from me. And we've talked about cups a little bit previously with the Passover meal and things like that. But the cup, it's really an image in the Bible. He says, Father, save me from this cup. And the cup, it's a metaphor. If you want to go to the next slide, you can. This is what a typical cup would have looked like that they used for the Passover meals, things like that. But the cup is a metaphor throughout the Bible. It appears different places in the Old Testament and the New Testament for a circumstance that God puts before someone. Like your server at a restaurant comes out with the drinks and says, here's your cup. Drink it, right? You ordered it, or maybe you didn't order it. Here's water. Drink it. Here's a drink. And so it presents circumstances or a situation that God puts before you as a cup that you're about to drink. But if we step back and we look at kind of how things balance out, it doesn't necessarily mean that it was totally caused by God. Because if we look at this circumstance that Jesus is walking through, God is bringing it to him. But who's responsible? Why is he having to go through these circumstances in the first place? What'd you say? Go ahead and give me an answer for that. What? Okay, I hear Satan in the room. So the deceiver, the slanderer, the one that's been opposed to God since the beginning of the story in the Bible, seemingly. So God's arch nemesis is behind part of this. Who else is responsible? We are. Yeah, exactly. The ones who walked away, right? The ones that he's trying to patch up that covenant and initiate a new covenant to change people's hearts that need to be changed and to relieve us from fear of this penalty that's attached to our covenants and our partnerships with God that we've kind of walked away from as humanity. Yeah, it's really us. So God's saying, here's this cup, but who's really responsible? We are. Yeah, and maybe Satan as well in some ways. But it's not God who, bears the weight of the responsibility, but he's bringing Jesus to this moment. So it's a metaphor for these circumstances. Is it a consequence? A lot of times in the Old Testament, a cup, it's specifically related to some consequence that someone's facing for committing an injustice. And with Jesus, I think you could say, well, Jesus didn't commit any injustices, but if he's taking on our injustices onto himself, then, in that sense, maybe it's consequential. But another question that invites is, are all cups a consequence? When things go awry in our lives and when God allows us to, walk into these circumstances that are just so heavy and pressing and filled with grief and loss, is that a consequence? Is that, something because we've done something wrong or we've walked away from God? And I think with that, like an honest look, you have to say no. Like, it doesn't necessarily mean that. There are other places in the New Testament where Jesus' students or other people around him, they ask him questions. And one of them is when his followers, his disciples and students, they're walking down the road and they pass a blind person on the side of the road. And they look at the blind person and turn to Jesus and say, Teacher, who sinned? Was it this guy or was it his parents? Like, whose fault is it that this this person was born with blindness. And Jesus just responds, he says, this guy didn't sin, or his parents, like, he's born blind so that God's works might be displayed in him. Like, you're thinking it's a consequence that he has to drink of this cup, but it's really so God can do his works through him and in this person's life. So comparing these hard circumstances and saying, well, God must be angry with me, he must be punishing me, we can't do that, because in a lot of instances, it's not connected with the consequence at all. It's because God has some work that he wants to display in our lives or in someone else's life somehow. And a lot of these situations, we're never going to fully wrap our mind around that. Like Job, you mentioning Job. Job never gets a fully complete answer as to why all this happens. God just gives Job his resume and says, here's who I am. Like, you going to trust me or not? There's not always a neat answer to those kinds of questions. And Jesus, he prays this prayer, Father, if it's possible, let this cup pass from me. He prays it 3 times over a few hours worth of time. And so he's praying many more things. Maybe similar things to what David prayed in Psalm 38. Maybe he's reflecting on the book of Job. We don't know. But there's a lot more that's happening in this prayer than just that line. But he concludes it. He says, yet not as I will, but as you will. So ultimately, he says, God, I want to go into your will. I do. I want to submit myself. I'm not going to refuse it, because he could have walked away. And he could have blamed the Father and said, how dare you forsake me? We've been together throughout all of eternity. How dare you look away from me in this moment? Or, I don't want to deal with it. I realize what's coming down in the next 24 hours, and these humans are not worth it. I'm sorry. I'm bailing. Like, I'm not willing to go through this. So he is submissive. Not because he thinks, oh, it's pointless to resist. Not because he's just said, well, I'm too tired, I'm not going to fight it. I think because he has a trust that the Father has some larger purpose in mind. We know Jesus is aware of that, what his death is going to accomplish for humanity, and that ultimately this is driven by the Father's love. But it's really hard for us to remember those things when we're going through those moments of being pressed. We want to get bitter. We want to just give up emotionally. We want to do what Jesus' students are doing at this point in time, because it wasn't just weighing on Jesus. Maybe it was weighing on Jesus the most, but it was also pressing down on his students in Gethsemane that night as well. We'll close off with this verse and just one follow-up statement. It says, then he came to the disciples after he'd been praying this prayer and found them sleeping. He asked Peter, so the 3 closer ones, so couldn't you stay awake with me 1 hour? And he said, stay awake and pray so that you won't enter into temptation. Or another way of translating it directly would be a test. This isn't just about me. I asked you to stay awake so you wouldn't enter into some kind of a test. And then he says, the spirit's willing, but your physical flesh, it's weak. So a second time he went away and prayed, my Father, if this can't pass unless I drink it, your will be done. And he came back, and again he found them sleeping because they couldn't keep their eyes open. And granted, it was late at night, but other gospel writers tell us the real reason why they couldn't keep their eyes open. It's because they were so discouraged and they were grieving over what Jesus was saying and what he was experiencing. Have any of you felt so depressed you just want to sleep? And so you have slept? Because that's how you cope. That's what's happening here. It says he came again and found them sleeping because they couldn't keep their eyes open. After leaving them, he went away and prayed a 3rd time, saying the same thing again. Then he came to his disciples and said to them, are you still sleeping and resting? Answer, yes, you are. And then he says, see, the time is near. The Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Get up, let's go. My betrayer is close. And that's how the passage we're looking at today ends. But he encourages his friends to pray for strength, because he says, this test that tests me, it's going to test you too. And sometimes we're the ones going through a test, and other times we're the ones that are close enough to watch somebody else go through the test. And it's hard to be in both positions, right? Some of you are suffering, and that's hard. And some of you are really in close proximity to other people who are being pressed, and it's hard for you too. And for both groups, how are we going to cope? How are we going to deal? And in this moment, it got so heavy on these students of Jesus that the only way they did in the moment was just by sleeping. the grief was so heavy and the depression was so heavy. I think this is a question worth asking. I need to wrap up this morning, but how might a person's grief, illness, pain, loss, or depression affect and test his or her family and close friends? What do you think? This will be our last question, and then I'll pray afterwards. How does someone else's grief or testing or pressing, how does it affect people in close proximity? What do you think? Maybe you are that person, or maybe you're watching somebody, in close proximity because you're being pressed in on. Pulls at your heart. Yeah. Like, because you can't do anything. You feel so powerless, and you're watching someone suffer. Yeah.
I think, too, you know that you have to walk with them through it. You have to be there to support them and be strong with them.
Okay. I heard she said you have to, you're there to walk through that with them, and you have to be strong, and you have to support them. And I would say, well, you don't. But I think it's honorable that you do, and I think Jesus would want us to. But some people, honestly, in these moments and these tests, they give up. And I've heard tragic stories like that as well of people who have divorced their spouse because their spouse came down with cancer, and they just didn't want to walk the road with them anymore. But the loving thing to do is to walk beside somebody through that, and to support them. Yeah. Any other final thoughts on that question? How does it affect or test a family member, a close friend? Share the burden. Mm-hmm.
It can change your life entirely, just like theirs.
That's a good point. Yeah, Char's saying this is going to change Jesus' friends' lives. From this point on, it's never going to be the same. And it's the same way. And you have to really realize, this may be life-altering, but, you are going to support this person through this, and there have been people in our community that have suffered life-altering losses just in the last 2 or 3 months. I could name several names, Life will never be the same after that point. Life will never be the same. But there is strength that's available in those moments, whether you're that person or you're the person supporting those people. And Jesus is using prayer to connect with God for strength. His followers eventually will, but right now they're coping by just sleeping, and going into depression. And then some people go the opposite direction and they walk away. So we see what's possible. We see different responses, and we're presented with a choice. How am I going to respond if I'm that person going through a pressing? Or how am I going to respond if I'm that person in close proximity to somebody else who's going through a pressing? We have some different options. Jesus shows us a way. His students show us a way. And there's multiple other ways, that may be good or very, very poor ways for us to cope and respond with that. But these are things that these stories bring about. It's not just a Bible story, so you learn some cool information about Jesus' life or his death. These are real things that we confront, and it's meant to help us process how we walk through the same kinds of scenarios and realize we're not alone, and even God himself understands exactly how we feel because he's walked through similar circumstances and on similar roads.